Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second official episode of the best podcast right now, Unbound Voices by the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, CSVR, if you like. My name is Athini, and today I am joined by the witty and ever so smart Nangamso from Africa Monitor. But I'll give her an opportunity a little later on to introduce herself. Today, we are discussing such an important historical landmark, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. 30 years ago, in 1995, a total of 189 countries convened to create a visionary roadmap for achieving equal rights for women and girls. The roadmap is now known as the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. The declaration outlined 12 critical areas for action, including violence against women, women in poverty, women's rights, and women's rights, most importantly, as human rights. And it was only in 1993 at the UN World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna where women's rights were explicitly recognized as human rights. Only in 1993. It actually feels so weird to say that out loud, that only in 1993, women's rights were only recognized as human rights. This declaration is considered one of the most progressive blueprints ever for advancing women's rights. It affirmed women's rights to live free of violence in today's world. But unfortunately, it seems that there has been a little fails down the line where we have failed to guarantee a world free of violence for women, particularly as we know in South Africa, GBV is still a high pervasive issue. And today we're really here to talk about reflectively some of the gaps and the opportunities that the Beijing Declaration might have missed. Nangamso, again, welcome. And how are you doing?
Thank you very much, Athini. It's awesome to be here with you today. And thank you very much for CSVR for making this platform and also creating this opportunity for us to engage. My name is Nangamso Kwinana, and I represent African Monitor. African Monitor is a non-profit organization dedicated to promoting sustainable development in Africa by monitoring resource flows, accountability, and social change. Established to amplify African voices, it works to empower communities, advocate for equitable policies, and foster transparency across the continent. Thank you once again, Ati. It's great to be here with you today.
Absolutely. Welcome. What commendable work that you guys do at Africa Monitor. It's such a pleasure to have you in studio today with me. Perhaps maybe to kickstart the conversation, in your own perspective, could you kindly and briefly explain what the Beijing Declaration and Platform is, and why is it considered one of the most progressive blueprints for women's rights?
Thank you so much, Athini. And I mean, taking back from your cue, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action is a comprehensive policy agenda for women's empowerment and gender equality. And as you've mentioned, it adopted unanimously by 189 countries during the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing. This was in September 1995. And of course, as South Africans, we will remember that the timing of the Beijing 1995 was crucial because our country was in the process of rebuilding its governance structures. The conference's commitments resonated deeply with South Africa's new constitution, which enshrined gender equality as a fundamental human right. The Beijing agenda aligned with the country's transformation, inspiring policies and institutional mechanisms that sought to correct historical injustices against women in this country.
Thank you for actually bringing in a little bit of context into our own South African perspective. I think we'll dive into that a little later on. But for now, I think it is interesting to me that only in 1993, at the UN World Conference on Human Rights, women's rights were explicitly recognized as human rights. Why was this sort of like the perfect groundwork for the Beijing Declaration?
If we look at the history and not just of South Africa as the world in general, women are definitely the most affected, were and still are mostly affected when it comes to changes in countries, changes in regions. For example, our region would be Africa, and any changes that take place on the global stage. You'll recall that during the days of war, it was women who were left behind to take care of families. It was women who were affected by anything that takes place at the economic stage, at the stage of war, at the stage of conflict. Even today, when conflict arises, it is women who are at the forefront of bearing the burden and the brunt of it. So I think if we take it back to that context, we can appreciate and also understand that the Beijing Declaration came at a time when women had been pushing for their equality, for their rights to also be recognized, because it was a collective cry of women across the globe that were indicating that enough is enough.
Absolutely. It is so interesting to me that women usually, and most of the time, quite frankly, are usually at the forefront of these movements. Any sort of movements, you will see women amalgamating together to sort of, restructure and run the movement. And yet they are usually the last to receive the privileges and the benefits of any movement, which is so sad. But again, as we've said, we'll discuss that a little later on. You mentioned earlier on in one of your answers that, in South Africa, we are also celebrating about 30 years of democracy, which is aligned with the landmark of the Beijing Declaration. Do you think that 30 years was enough time, particularly for the Beijing Declaration, to fulfill its promise to give women and girls equal rights?
30 years is definitely not enough time. South Africa has implemented some of the world's most progressive gender policies, inspired by both the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Also, if we look at the implementations made in South Africa, some of the key legislative milestones can include the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, the Domestic Violence Act and its recent amendments, the Sexual Offences Act, the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide, and of course, the Women and Gender Equality Bill. South Africa has been acclaimed for increasing women's political representation, and the Beijing Plus 30 report highlights that 46% of parliamentary seats are held by women. Even the Speaker of South Africa's National Assembly is also a woman. Women occupy key leadership positions in our country. Cabinet ministries, the judiciary, local government, gender mainstreaming and governance structures has definitely improved. However, going back to your question, is 30 years sufficient? I think we've done a great deal of work. However, there is certainly still room for improving on the progress that we have implemented as a country. If we go back to reflect on the review of South Africa's progress, when we look at the Voluntary National Review of 2024, which is the recent Voluntary National Review that South Africa has contributed to the United Nations, you'll see that during 2019, we had the first, and during 2022, we provided the second insight of the nation's progress towards achieving gender equality. And with the country's first underscoring the country's dedication to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, during that phase, we highlighted both advancements and ongoing challenges in promoting gender equality. When we looked at 2024, there were some redresses that took place, and we looked at how we could improve on those, particularly in the areas targeting poverty reduction, job creation, and of course, economic growth.
Absolutely. Nangamso, as you've mentioned, 30 years ago, the Beijing Declaration promised that women and girls would live in a environment, in a world that is free from violence. And you've also mentioned that South Africa has one of the most progressive constitutions and laws and legislations in the world to particularly protect women against violence as well, right? And it is said, however, that still one in three of women will still experience violence in their lifetime, right? And according to the Women's Global Database, there is about 1,583 legislative measures enlisted to protect women from violence. Yet we still have such a gruesome, pervasive level of violence, particularly in South Africa and globally. Why is this?
South Africa is amongst the most unequal countries in the world. And the inequality is definitely gendered. Women in South Africa are poorer than men, and women spend 8 times the amount of time on unpaid domestic work than men. And despite making up 51% of the population, women own less than 15% of land in this country. Then we take it to customary law, which governs rural women's lives. And although the Constitution calls for the rights of all, regardless of race, culture, and religion, it also allows people to practice their culture. Most South African traditional cultures are very patriarchal and are governed by customary law, which puts women in subordinate positions that do not allow them to own land or any production resources. While we have been making efforts when it comes to legislative reforms, customary law, and promote gender equality, such as the Recognition of Customary Marriages Act of 1998, in some rural communities, traditional practices still continue to influence the daily lives of women, underscoring the ongoing need for advocacy and reform to ensure that customary law aligns with the constitutional principles of equality and human rights.
Absolutely. It's so interesting that you mentioned that because I'm thinking, despite these legislations, these policies, these laws, there is still pretty much a difficulty in trying to reconstruct a new norm for us, particularly as South Africans. As you said, there are traditional cultural practices that kind of hinder the development, the growth, and the freedom of women. Why is it so difficult, or why is it so difficult for the law to be able to address cultural gendered norms?
I mean, it speaks to the socialization, it speaks to the community, it speaks to the family structure, it speaks to the psychological empowerment of individuals, both men and women, which ultimately filters down to the psychological empowerment of children. Not so long ago, we were all outraged in the country when we heard about what is happening in Matatiele. Of course, the outbreak was ignited by the rape that occurred to a 7-year-old girl who is named Kwekwe.
Mm.
And when we looked at that story and we looked at that lived experience of that little girl and that family, we realized and got to learn that the incident is actually affecting the entire community and not just that one family. Despite all these advantages and all these advances that South Africa has made, we definitely are acknowledging that there are several deep-rooted challenges that continue to undermine gender equality in South Africa. For example, South Africa faces one of the highest rates of gender-based violence globally, often described as a pandemic within a pandemic itself. Femicide, rape, and domestic violence remain critical issues despite legal protections. And what we've cited earlier are legal provisions. And legal provisions, they do not find a way to be monitored within a home structure and within a community structure, which means that we need to tap into the local governance and look at how do we mainstream oversight and monitoring in such a way that we ensure that the legislation is implemented is monitored, there is the necessary oversight so that women and girls remain to be protected. The country also has one of the highest rape rates globally, with 132 incidents per 10,000 people. And this not only includes women, but it also includes young children who are unable to actually protect themselves. The violence that women and girls face is also experienced in online spaces. South Africa has the highest rate of cyberbullying in the world. The implementation gap between policy and reality remains stark, with many survivors struggling to access justice and support services.
Absolutely, you're right. There is such a stark dichotomy between national laws and how they are reflected within communities, and particularly smaller communities. And I think there needs to be a mechanism where we are able to localize some of these laws within smaller communities. You just mentioned accessibility to essential services. And this was also such a sort of profound progression within the Beijing Declaration, where they've kind of expanded the access to social services such as shelters, legal aid, medical care, and mental health services. How effective have these initiatives been?
Look, I think going forward, Athini, the call to action is for ensuring that these commitments actually translate into tangible, lived realities for every South African woman and girl. I think what we need to focus on is that for the next 30 years, we must redefine our action in order for accountability, renewed social contract for gender equality, and security for all women and girls in this country. It cannot be that we are not safe within a post office. If you remember,
Mhm.
Uyinene,
Mm.
we cannot comprehend that a 7-year-old girl cannot be safe within a school compound. And that would be the lived reality of Kwekwe and her family. It cannot be that even within the church, we do not find safety. And many other cases, not only the ones that we are mentioning now, many other cases of unnamed and unreported South Africans, they exist. How do we ensure that in the next years to come, we protect these women and we protect these girls as communities, as individuals, and as a country?
Absolutely. And I think in the last 30 years, there has been sort of profound awareness raising when it comes to gender based violence and violence against women generally, right? But you would find that in smaller communities, people, particularly victims and survivors, they still don't know where to access these essential services. Has there been a failure in advocating, raising awareness, particularly when it comes to the provision of essential services? Are there enough essential services, and is that why people don't have access to them? What's your take on that, just in terms of the accessibility of essential services? Because you would find that in the most prominent areas, essential services are easily accessible. And in areas that are different from that, there's probably like a paucity, there's scarcity of essential services, and particularly around mental health, you know. And what's your take on that, just in terms of accessibility of essential services?
I think the lived realities are different in the city structure, your metropolitan areas versus the rural areas. I think when we look at the cities and the metros, these services, you find that there is more than one facility that is available for one to seek support from. However, when you go into the rural areas, you find that there is one facility and it may be catering to a much higher demand than the resources that are available.
Right.
We have to also consider that facilities are managed by human beings.
Mhm.
So we need to look at the ratio of the population that relies on the service versus the amount of actually the service men and women that are available to cater for that service.
Right.
So when we look at the rural areas, you find that the population is much higher than the available staff that are able to offer the service. And I think that's where the missing link comes in. How do we incentivize more of our servants to actually offer their skills and expertise in the rural communities? And we make sure that we also balance the mental empowerment so that the demand does not exceed the available resources.
Right.
I don't know if you're getting me there.
Absolutely. You just exploded my perspective because it's easy to pinpoint and say they're failing to implement when you haven't really sort of considered the depth of the implementation. And speaking of implementation, who do we hold responsible for some of the declarations and the promises made by Beijing and our country as well?
I think you've answered your own question. Those who committed are ultimately responsible for holding up their commitment. Also, if you look at the structure and the relationship between government and citizen, it is the government who is responsible for ensuring that the legislation covers, protects the citizens. However, we don't expect that our government should carry the baton alone. That is why you've got multi-stakeholder partners that are there to support government in ensuring that the responsibility is carried by all of those development partners. And here I am reflecting on the Chapter 9 institutions. I am reflecting on the legislative. I am reflecting on the civil society organizations. I am also reflecting on the international organizations that are available to support us.
Absolutely.
In the world that we live in today, we are no longer isolated as nations, as states. We live in a global society, which is where we can also seek support. And if we look at multi-stakeholder partnerships as our way of ensuring that our commitments are achieved, I think we would be able to find ourselves moving the needle much closer to where we want to find ourselves and much closer to a target that we would set for ourselves as a country going into the next 30 years.
I have to agree with you. There is not I have to agree with you. I think it is important that we kind of eradicate our sort of thinking of working in silos because so far it really hasn't worked. And beyond the multi stakeholder approach and the collaborative coordination, what other resources and strategies can you think of that we can employ to ensure that there is effective implementation?
That's a very good question. And looking at that question, I think let's also stretch it further. How do we mobilize resources and garner support to support us with implementing national, regional, and global development agendas? Then we take it a step further and look at how does that support and those resources assist us with implementing and monitoring, particularly the achievement of SDG 5. Now, there's quite a number of multifaceted approaches that we can consider here. Among those would be the forging of strategic partnerships, where governments, civil society organizations, private sector entities, and international agencies pool resources and expertise. For instance, the United Nations offers quite a diverse course of partnerships and financing for sustainable development, emphasizing on the importance of joint efforts in achieving the 2030 agenda. Amongst those, we could also look at how do we develop a comprehensive resource mobilization strategy where we craft a detailed plan that outlines financial targets, identifies potential donors, and sets clear objectives. Resource mobilization serves as a model, which also highlights the importance of understanding partnerships. And partnerships is really where we anchor not only the mobilization of resources, but also the multi-stakeholderness. We could also look at engaging in advocacy and awareness campaigns. And this is where we raise public awareness about gender equality issues so that we may be able to attract support from a diverse pool of stakeholders. This is where we also highlight the progress and also the challenges since the adoption of the Beijing Declaration. We could also leverage public-private partnerships, where we engage private sector partners through initiatives that align corporate social responsibility goals with gender equality objectives. We could also utilize capacity building programs, where we invest in training programs that enhance the skills of those that are affected. And we could also target the perpetrators. Amongst our pool of strategies, we could also look at establishing accountability mechanisms. This is where we look at how do we invite local government to be part of oversight in order to make sure that individuals and communities remain protected. We touched on it earlier, Athini, where we said in South Africa, we are not short of legislative measures. Our gaps, our challenges seem to be more on the implementation and the oversight. So this is where we also encourage local government to be part of establishing accountability mechanisms. And lastly, I would also insert that let's tap into innovative financing mechanisms where we explore alternative funding sources such as social impact bonds, crowdfunding, or even dedicated levies that can provide additional resources for gender equality programs. I think by integrating these strategies, stakeholders can enhance their efforts to mobilize the necessary resources and support for the effective implementation of not only SDG 5, but also the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action.
Absolutely, Nangamso. That is such a comprehensive strategies, and I'm sure the right people are listening. So thank you so much for such a elaborative answer. And I do appreciate the multifaceted and multi-stakeholder collaboration, and I think it's important, and I think it's essential for the achievement of proper implementation. However, in cases where the implementation is not a success, one, who do we hold accountable, right? And I want us to think about accountability beyond just discussion that, oh, you weren't able to achieve this and, what happens then? But think about accountability in the sense of what actions do we take after failure of implementation or failure of proper implementation, I should rather say, right? And two, in the cases where implementation is successful, considering that, achievement of such strategies need to be more collaborative, who do we then credit? Considering that it's such a multifaceted stakeholder coordination. So the one question is about accountability and the one question is about credit.
I think, Athini, if we are moving forward and we are collaborating as multiple development stakeholder partners, then ultimately the credit and the responsibility will be on the shoulders of all the partners. However, we are centered and led by our government. So yes, the responsibility will be for all to carry. However, the center is on the shoulders of government. I would then look at how do we ensure that government is incorporating the support that is available? How do we ensure that government is ensuring that this is an inclusive platform where we are all invested into contributing to moving that needle of progress to be able to achieve the necessary goals and to be able to achieve the necessary commitments.
Thanks, Nangamso, for that. I think in the last couple of years, we have really focused on strategies that are usually responsive than preventative, right? And the Beijing Declaration kind of emphasizes the importance of prevention, right? And some of the prevention strategies include education, awareness raising, and awareness campaigns, right? But prevention is usually very difficult, right? Because it means that we have to reevaluate our social norms and cultural practices, right? Why is it so difficult for us to adopt cultural and social norms that are new?
And I think prevention not only is linked to empowering the individual to be vigilant, but also it goes hand in hand with socializing the perpetrator to understand the impact of their actions.
Absolutely.
And I think once we take it back to the family structure, that is probably where we would also be able to draw on indigenous knowledge to be able to help us cross that bridge. For me, it goes back to the source. And the source is the individual. And there are two individuals. There is the perpetrator, and then there is the one who experiences, who in some circles would be called the victim. But I don't think that victim is a loose title that we can hand over to everyone who has experienced some form of violence that has been enacted upon their person. So I think that is where I would hinge it. I would hinge it on the family structure. I would hinge it on the individual structure. And I would look at how do we ensure that those individuals within a community are anchored on empowerment.
Right. Absolutely. And I kind of want to play the devil's advocate a little bit because it's so interesting for me when people sort of bring up this dynamic of perpetratorship, right? Because from my understanding, at least, and from the research that I've kind of been doing at school, is that a perpetrator usually is a victim of violence themselves, of some sort of violence. And it doesn't necessarily have to be GBV, for example. It can be historical violence and it can be structural violence. How do we bring that up to the shore, right? And acknowledge it without vilifying the perpetrator? How do we oscillate that conversation between the perpetrator and the victim, but also a focus particularly on the perpetrator to say that one of the reasons why you are so violent, my friend, is because you have in some way experienced violence yourself? How do we acknowledge that without seeming that our focus is suddenly turned into focusing on the perpetrator?
That's actually very imperative. And I think I would here also suggest that perhaps let's look at the next episode that could touch on trauma-informed psychological support, because we cannot be able to isolate the actions of a perpetrator cannot be isolated from their own upbringing and lived experiences. So I think this is where I would pass it back to your court to say, going forward, perhaps let's look at inviting expertise that could shed light on what kind of trauma-informed psychological support would be valuable to include in our strategies.
Absolutely. It's a difficult conversation and it's a difficult question to answer because we have to date it back to perhaps even colonialism, where people of color experience such a traumatic form of violence that has changed their way of being. And so we would need another episode for sure. And maybe we can sort of move on to data collection, which is such a paramount and important part of monitoring, I suppose. And it plays such a pivotal role in addressing violence against women. But particularly in South Africa, we know that our data collection is a little bit sketchy, right? It's sometimes inaccurate. And because also it's quite statistical, I'm a qualitative student. And so I don't necessarily always agree with numbers in the sense that numbers don't necessarily reflect the true textual reality of people, right? It's easy to quantify stories of trauma and it's easy to quantify victims, but it's not necessarily easy to dive into the more qualitative stuff. What kind of violence is, and then figuring out how to address it. But anyway, I'm digressing. Why is data collection important in this process?
I think data collection is important in every process that involves assessing the progress on development commitments. I'll go back to the SDGI initiative, which is the Sustainable Development Goals Initiative, which is a partnership, quite a dynamic partnership, between the Presidency of South Africa, the University of Pretoria, Stellenbosch University, and also African Monitor. And this is powered by GIZ. The SDGI's key objective is for the South African government to increasingly utilize the evidence-based recommendations of the Policy and Research Services Unit, which is within the presidency of our country. And what this partnership is looking at is firstly, bridging the gap between academia and policymakers by harnessing the expertise of South Africa's public universities to assist with evidence and also data. Secondly, it looks at strengthening the capacity to drive evidence-based policy development through collaboration and also knowledge sharing. And thirdly, it looks at supporting the inclusive dialogue between government and development stakeholders. So those are the kind of suggestions that I would also consider when we look at how do we ensure that data feeds into understanding the reality of our country and also looks at suggesting policies, monitoring, evaluation that seeks to achieve whatever the objectives and whatever the commitments that our country has entered into on behalf of our citizens.
Absolutely. I think data collection plays a very important role in making visible what is invisible. And I think, accurate data collection can really sort of uplift a lot of things. So perhaps maybe looking into the future a little bit, um, we have sort of mentioned the importance of collaborative efforts and involving different stakeholders. And I want to ask you perhaps on male allyship is often discussed in the context of human rights. What is your take on male involvement in ending violence against women?
That's a very interesting question, considering that you are a man yourself. Let me not speak on behalf of males. I think it would be interesting to hear your perspective. You are one of the leading figures within the gender program unit at CSVR. It would be interesting for the audience to hear from you what your perspectives may be. What made you invest your expertise and your skills and your time to ensuring that all human rights are protected and advocated for, and also that gender equality is necessary for all of us to invest in?
Putting me in the hot spot here. I think it's a very interesting and paradoxical and often very contradictory conversation because it's so dynamic that we would have to talk about the relationship between feminism and perhaps even male privilege and what that looks like as a collaborative, effort. I think in my past experiences when I had conversations with men is that they would one first acknowledge the fact that they feel that the term gender is synonymized to women. And so they have no identification of what it means to be, a gender activist because they think that the term in itself means women. And so immediately they retract because they feel that there's no inclusion, there's no involvement of them, right? And when we do sort of discuss male allyship, particularly when it comes to feminism, there are, as we can acknowledge, a few feminist movements that would completely not agree to that movement, right? Um, because of what men have been historically. We understand that they've always played in positions of power and dominance, right? And they've resisted giving up and sharing that power. And so a lot of feminists worry that the involvement of male figures when it comes to feminist movements, that it would be distracting. It would steer the focus at some times. And so we would really have to think about a way that is focused on women, that doesn't necessarily take away from the important sort of priority that we are trying to achieve, gender equality, right? And particularly our focus is women because they have historically been disproportionately affected, right? And so it's contradictive in the sense that how do we propose this to males? How do we say that gender equality is good for you as well? Some know it's good for them as well, but they're just not willing to give up their male privilege. And in order to achieve gender equality, you would have to negotiate power. You would have to surrender some level of power in order for the power to be shared. And it goes back to your answer earlier on about it starts with family dynamics. It would also restructure family dynamics because the head of the household traditionally is known as the male, right? And it's not just a position, it's a position of power, right? And we would have to consider what family dynamics look like when we have shared power and responsibilities, right? And redefining the definition of masculinity as well, right? The traditional definitions of masculinities as they stand, they pit men into positions of power, right? It's about being in a position of power. Not to sound reiterative, but there's no other way of putting it. You know, the whole sort of definition of masculinity is embedded in being a powerful figure. We'd have to renegotiate that. We would have to find a definition of masculinity that is not necessarily toxic, if I can say, right? And we would have, I don't know if this is the right word, to desocialize what we have come to know about manhood and try to think about manhood, what it would look like in the future. And so again, but I think the basis really is just the regeneration of new norms. I think there is obviously a lot of men who want to get involved in the participation of gender equality, but there just needs to be a collaborative effort that understands and also recognizes men, as we've previously engaged, as victims as well of, you know, a historical past that was violent. And so it would have to be like it's a very long and difficult answer and question. It will take a lot of deconstructing. Yes, I think that really draws us closer to the end of our conversation. Um, any call for action before we close off?
Thank you so much, Athini. You know, high five to yourself and men like you who are actually part of the solution. Thank you for speaking up. Thank you for galvanizing support from other men to also understand that when we speak about gender equality, when we look at the Beijing Declaration, when we look at achieving SDG 5, and when we look at achieving development goals in general, whether national, regional, or global, we understand that these are commitments that seek to advance our lives, not our lives as women, but our lives as humans
Absolutely.
in the entire world. It's not something that anyone can do on their own. Not one organization can do it on their own. Much like I said previously, that as much as our anchor and our centerpiece would be governments, but governments too, they require the support of other development stakeholders. So thank you very much to men like yourselves that are part of the solution. We hope that by engaging in these conversations, we move forward, relearn, unlearn, and get to a point where we understand what is our role, all of us. What is our role in ensuring that our nation moves forward so that our kids and the future generations that get to inherit these countries to be able to move on and be able to progress to the next level. Yes, definitely, we do have some room for improving, but absolutely, I think we've done a great deal. There is more work to be done, and that work can only be achieved with all of us being part of the solution. So thank you very much to everyone that has listened today. It's basically been a conversation between myself and Athini, representing African Monitor and CSVR. And thank you very much to your team for availing this opportunity. I've had a great time engaging with you, and I look forward to the future of the series.
You had a great time. I had a better time. Thank you so much, Nangamso, for your time, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.